Meanwhile, we're talking about the freebie debate. It continues to rage. Hearing a plea on this issue, the Supreme Court has said today that the centre must define what freebies really are. In fact, the Supreme Court has also questioned if schemes like MNREGA, which provide dignity of life, can be called freebies at all. The Supreme Court has said that political parties cannot be prevented from making promises. Remember, earlier this month, the Supreme Court had said that the distribution of freebies will inevitably lead to economic disaster. The DMK on its part, as a political party, had approached the Supreme Court against the petition that was filed by the former BJP spokesperson and lawyer, Ashwini Upadhyay. And after the DMK, Arvind Kejriwal, also the Chief Minister of Telangana, KCR, they've all hit out at the centre for calling welfare schemes as freebies. So the question is still out. What exactly are freebies? How can we define them? Of course, the Supreme Court is going to have the next hearing in this case on the 22nd of August. But really, the debate rages on, and we want to discuss this perhaps a little bit at length. Joining us on the panel tonight is Mythili Bhusnurmath, our consulting editor here at ET Now. Also, Manisha Priyam is with us, political analyst. And Mitali Nikore is founder and economist at Nikore Associates. Great to have you with us all. But let me start by asking about freebies. As we understand it, they're almost a part of our political DNA in India. Every election season, in fact, we are so used to politicians promising these freebies, promising them to the electorate. And we are so used to seeing these promises of freebies garnering votes as well. We don't really think twice about them. But the Prime Minister has set the agenda for the freebies debate, as it were, warning the opposition and the people at large against it, saying there would be a drain on the economy because it takes away resources that would otherwise be used for building infrastructure. So how do we define freebies? That's the sketchy part. And part of the problem lies in that itself. The Supreme Court, like I mentioned, is asking if water, electricity can even be considered freebies. Mythili, do come in on this. From an economic standpoint, is part of the problem the fact that we have not been able to define what is a freebie and what isn't?
Well, Vikram, the fact is we never will be able to define what a freebie is and what a freebie is not. That is something that is left to, something that is to be decided between the electorate and the political parties, which is why economists never talk really in terms of freebies. They talk in terms of subsidies as merit subsidies and non-merit subsidies. Merit subsidies are those which have some positive externalities, like say primary health, primary education, which helps the entire society. Whereas a non-merit subsidy is everything else. So economists never talk of freebies. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court, to my mind, has waded into an area which is clearly outside their remit. This is not for the Supreme Court to decide what is a freebie and what is not, or even for any kind of expert committee. The fact is that the Indian Constitution clearly talks of separation of powers between the three wings, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And each one has its own defined role. And the idea is that each one should not step into what another arm's role is. Unfortunately, we have had instances in the past, because it's not a very watertight compartment, but at the same time, they have broadly respected the contours of this, and which is why very often we hear of talk of, judicial activism, judicial overreach, etc. So judicial overreach is something that the judiciary should really steer clear of, because what is a freebie itself is very difficult to define. And here I would agree with the DMK when they say something that is spent for welfare, like the midday meal scheme, for instance. Was it a freebie? Was it not? It is up to the electorate and the political parties to decide. Yes, there is a cost, long-term cost, but that is for the voters and political parties to decide, not for the judiciary.
It is a political question, as it were. Manisha Priyam, do come in. The Prime Minister perhaps was making a statement against the Aam Aadmi Party that had announced free power to people in poll-bound Gujarat and Himachal Pradesh. Now, Arvind Kejriwal has responded to the statement made by the Prime Minister, saying that his government schemes are not freebies, but efforts to lay the foundation for making India the #1 country in the world. So not just from an economic standpoint, politically also, one needs to differentiate between what are freebies and what are welfare stops, like Mythili is saying. Now, are politicians, with purpose, muddling up these definitions to fight election battles? What do you see, according to you? Because the jury is still out on whether free power, cash, gold that are promised in an election campaign are at par with welfare schemes that the government is constitutionally obligated to provide for its citizens, which the Supreme Court seems to be alluding to, at least over here, at least for the time being.
So, I would agree with Mythili and say that, defining what is a freebie and what is not a freebie is a very difficult scenario. Now, I'm going to throw it back to you. Politicians are not vain actors. Politicians understand what their electorate needs and they put things on offer. Now, there have been economic critiques of politics, and that critique has said spokesperson politics, where you give something to get a vote in exchange, is not on. But let me now try and tell you that this theorem of economics translated into actual reality. Now, in midday meal, I saw, for example, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, which was the last of the southern states, by the way, all the southern states had a noon meal scheme in place. Now, Andhra Pradesh first gave free ration at the school point. Then it started getting in the women SHGs to cook a meal for its children. Then another politician or political party came in and they said, let's add an egg to this. Another one came and said, let's add some, curd rice to this, or let's add some buttermilk to this. Now, all these are nutritious meals. The jury can go out and we can tell each other and pat each other on the back. The biggest difference that has been made to school enrollments in India has been because of the midday meal scheme. I remember very much that in 95, when the grain stocks were rotting in the FCI godowns and the noon meal was added, I used to feel, this will be a burden on the teachers. But 20 years down the line, it is me who believes that the difference in terms of inviting schools, caring schools, has been made by having a country-wide midday meal scheme, wherein you give children a meal that is nutritious, wholesome, cooked at the school point. Forget the fact that the teachers have an extra burden on them. The school looks far more inviting. I'm sitting in a remote Bihar village, which is why I'm not on the video link with you. The biggest difference has been made by this. Now let's come to many other schemes. There was a scheme called the Atta Dal scheme put forward by the Shiromani Akali Dal in the last assembly elections.
Yes.
But where was the critique coming from the BJP? The BJP was then partners of the SID in that election. So just one thing called free electricity, which is actually not free electricity,
right,
is just grading it in terms of who can pay and who cannot pay. Beyond a point, the returns from asking for very little bills may not be, economic enough. That trade-off can be made. Now, is any government in this country, borrowing from Peter to be able to give this free electricity? Is somebody else paying for it? Is the public exchange paying for it? Are we lacking port?
Well, that is the real question, isn't it, Manisha Priyam? As far as freebies are concerned, another big question to ask is, who's really paying for them? Taxpayers. The RBI has spoken about this as well. Some freebies, they say, may benefit the poor if they're properly targeted with minimal leakages. But their advantages, the RBI says, must be evaluated against the large fiscal costs and inefficiencies that they cause by distorting prices and misallocating resources. The truth is really that we are living in these highly inflationary times. Prices of everything are going up. Surely one part of the debate is that the economically challenged need some of these freebies. If we were to buy into that argument, the question arises, Mitali Nikore, how much of a drain is it really on the Indian economy, and can one even call it a drain if that's the need of the Indian economy, which is, of course, still developing?
Absolutely, Vikram. Thanks for bringing me in today. Very excited to join this debate. I think it's very important that we first view this entire debate from the prism of income inequality as it exists today and as it's increased over the last few decades. So at Nikore Associates, my team has done this analysis using the World Inequality Database. And what they find is that the income of the bottom 50% of the population used to be almost 15 to 20% of the GDP in the 1960s, is now just 2.5%. So what we're finding is that a lot of the growth in the last 4 or 5 decades has actually benefited, of course, the ones who are rich, and the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. And now that we are cognizant of this data, there's a lot more that we can do to support those who are vulnerable and have become even more vulnerable during COVID. So a lot of the, whatever we are calling as freebies, I completely agree that, it's very difficult to define freebies. For any economist to come and say, oh, this is social protection, but this is a freebie, it's not possible. However, at the same time, there are certain criteria that can be applied to say this is where social protection should stop, or this is the number of years after which it should stop. And for that, we need a proper social protection architecture, social security norms, laws, guidelines, and regulations as those exist in a number of developed countries. I mean, we know that there are certain criteria after which someone qualifies for unemployment insurance, for example, in the US or in Europe. So, we can have those criteria coming in. The second issue with the Indian social protection architecture as it stands is that a lot of the schemes that are intended to benefit the poor are not reaching them. While some are reaching them very well, others are probably not performing as well. So, having those norms around an audit of those schemes like the CAG does, and then taking into account when a scheme is not actually doing well, shutting it down. These are, actions which state governments and the central government should be taking on the guidance of the CAG. But at this point, it doesn't happen, So these are some of the correct questions that we should be asking, that, at what point and how do we define entitlements, and how do we make sure that they are most efficient,
Yeah, so this social architecture that we're talking about, is the resolution within that, Mythili, the RBI, because we have to consider the downsides of this. They're saying the provision of free electricity or free water or free public transport, the waiver of pending utility bills or farm loan waivers, they are often regarded as freebies, which potentially, they say, undermine credit culture. The RBI says it distorts prices through cross-subsidization, eroding incentives for private investment, and also disincentivizing work at the current wage rate, which leads to a drop, they say, in the participation of the labor force. Now, those are clear downsides of freebies. There are central expenditures, like public distribution system is an expenditure, employment guarantee schemes, we spoke about MNREGA, education, healthcare, these are facilities, and they're not considered freebies. There are clearly two sides to this entire definition of freebies, but if one considers this an entirely economic problem that India has to resolve, in your opinion, how is this going to get resolved from the standpoint that we are currently at the stage of development of our economy that we are at now?
Well, I'm afraid, Vikram, is not going to be resolved easily, because this is something that falls in the area not of pure economics, but it's a political economy question, which is ultimately why it's only when the democracy matures that you will find this freebie culture finally being phased out. I would agree with the RBI that there is a cost, an enormous cost, both direct as well as indirect in terms of misallocation of resources. But it is ultimately for the people of the country to decide, which is why political parties and voters must realize that if we vote for a party that is going to go on promising, free electricity, free power, mind you, not targeted is fine. If it is being targeted and given to only those who are below the poverty line, who cannot pay for their food, cannot pay for their electricity, that's a different matter. But in many cases, these are given across the board, in which case it is a huge cost. But this is something that can come only from the maturing of democracy, and courts and the Reserve Bank can talk till kingdom come. But I'm afraid there is not going to be an answer until political parties and voters mature, and that will happen slowly but painfully over a period of time.
We'll have to be patient about this, is what you're suggesting, Mythili. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has said that we need to find that balance. We have to strike that balance between the economy losing money because of freebies and welfare measures that are taken up by governments. Because these are two different things. We'll see how the resolution is struck and whether we can find that balance within our current political landscape or not, and the compulsions of electoral politics that we live in 365 days, 24/7. But thank you, ladies, for joining us with your perspective on this. It's an ongoing debate, and it's going to continue to rage on.